rural sociologist at that other Iowa university called Iowa State University. We specialize mainly in issues of agriculture and in rural communities. And I'm lead on a USDA AFRI grant looking at the opioid epidemic in rural and micropolitan communities. And so what I'm presenting today is a paper that we've written based on from the funds from this grant and from our research, with the co-authors being Shannon Monat. She's a public health researcher at Syracuse. Andy Hochstetler, he's a criminologist at Iowa State. And Mark Berg, who's at the University of Iowa, that looks at drug policy. So this is the first stage of a multi-stage or multi-objective project from our USDA grant. So at the end of this presentation, I have our website, our project website, that if you're interested in what we're doing and our future work, you can visit that website and get updates. So the one question, if it isn't apparent to all of you, obviously you registered for the opioid webinar, and so this may be news to all of you, but particularly in Iowa and parts of the upper Midwest, people ask, why do I hear all these news about opioids in the paper? And isn't drug use mainly an issue of large cities? Well, that's what makes this opioid drug crisis particularly interesting, is that the growth in opioid deaths has been fastest in outside of large cities. For example, in the United States, since 1999 to 2016, there's been nearly an 800% gain in opioid deaths from 1999 to 2016 in micropolitan communities. And again, a micropolitan county is a county that has a city of at least 10,000 but is under 50,000. There's been an over 700% gain in rural
so David,
counties. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but I think the slides, if you've been trying to advance, we're still seeing the welcome slide. So we do see the welcome slide. There we go. Now it's advancing.
Okay. Is it just the full slide, or is it the?
It's the full slide on the title page. Yep.
Great. All right. Well, let me advance. You can look through the slides, the first slide and this slide. But again, now that you're seeing the histogram of death rates, you see what I was mentioning, that opioid use disorder deaths have grown. The number of deaths has grown very quickly in smaller cities and in rural areas versus in larger metropolitan areas. And the other reason why there's such concern over opioids is that, my latest tally and by the 2016 data that we have from CDC, a little over 2/3 of all drug overdose deaths in the United States are attributable to one or more opioids. That's a lot. So most overdose deaths are being driven by opioids. And a study done about 4 years ago tallies the total economic impact of opioid addiction and death at $80 billion each year. And so as the opioid epidemic has even grown since 4 years ago, I would expect that number to be higher. So this all illustrates a very strong public rationale for understanding what's driving the opioid epidemic and hopefully what might be able to prevent it. So place-based research on what's driving opioid mortality in counties and cities is an emerging area. There's beginning to be a lot of research being done on that, but there are some unanswered questions. The first is that most studies look at all opioid use disorder deaths, and very few to date have disaggregated those by type of drug. So the question becomes, is it really a single opioid epidemic, or do we really have multiple opioid epidemics based on the type of drug? One substantive question is whether communities that have high opioid mortality, if that's driven by the simple fact that they always had a drug problem to begin with, is this a long-term drug problem, or is it driven by long-term economic decline, or some combination of the both? Again, that hasn't been settled in the literature. Going back to my first point, there's need to understand, are there different dynamics on what drives prescription mortality in a community versus heroin mortality or synthetic mortality, and that's usually supplied through drug trafficking organizations. And finally, my main interests are there differences in rural and urban communities. So to answer these questions, our paper that's posted on our website, we want to document the trends in opioid mortality by drug and by what we call core-based statistical areas. These are just finer delineations of urban and rural. We want to identify mortality clusters using something called latent profile analysis at the county level. Then we're going to employ some standard regression models to try to predict membership in these clusters using a host of economic and demographic factors. And then we're going to compare these models in rural and urban contexts. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this. It's a pretty dead slide, but our research is grounded in three main literatures out of three separate disciplines. The first, obviously, we pull heavily on the public health literature. And as I said in the few slides back, there is an emerging body of work looking at the place-based determinants of opioid addiction. And what this work has found is that prescription opioid use deaths are higher in rural areas, heroin deaths are higher in metro areas, but this literature also documented that heroin is a growing problem in rural places. Poverty, unemployment, and low education are all sort of related factors that seem to drive community susceptibility to opioid mortality, as well as having a large numbers of people over 65, usually as the suppliers of pills. When other researchers have looked at individual-based causes of mortality, opioid mortality, they find it tends to hit the younger Americans. Native Americans are more susceptible to opioid death. Those that are on some sort of disability, particularly a work disability, and those who were employed in manual or blue-collar work that tends to be more injury-prone. The second literature we draw on really tries to explain why this has happened, why this is happening in 1999 and why it didn't happen in 1989 or 1979. And we pull on the economic restructuring literature from sociology, which very quickly says that as our economy from the 1930s up until the mid-1980s, the U.S. had what sociologists term a Fordist political economic system. And this Fordist system was national-based. It was based on goods production, and it had welfare state capitalism. So essentially high tax rates, more generous social programs. So it was America's version of social democracy that we had from the Great Depression through the 1980s Reagan neoliberal movement. What shifted from the 1980s until now is what we call the post-Fordist system, that is more global integration of the economy, deregulation of the economy, reduction in taxes, reduction or dismantling of welfare state protections. And so what we term as this great U-turn in terms of inequality and poverty, what we see is that this dismantling of welfare state protections, what sociologists have argued, has driven social problems. And there's also been concentration in the agricultural industry that has resulted in fewer farms, fewer opportunities to farm, fewer job opportunities to farm in rural America, and it's been replaced by larger scale industrial farms. And that's through the Goldschmidt hypothesis. But these two, the public health literature and this restructuring literature, one of the main issues with that is you have a lot of communities that have gone through massive industrial restructuring but don't have an opioid problem. So to explain this discrepancy, we pull on the social disorganization theory from criminology, and the criminologists argue it's not restructuring per se that matters, it's the disorganization that results from economic restructuring. So what they argue is that economic decline creates disorder in these communities by breaking down informal social controls, by creating vacant spaces or unregulated spaces for crime to occur. As people don't have income, it creates more opportunities or more motivations for people to commit crimes. So it's this disorder, this disorganization that facilitates and doesn't sanction antisocial activities like property crime, drug and alcohol use, corruption. In these disorganized communities, people stop caring about the community and they move into gated communities, or there's white flight or middle class flight outside of certain communities into surrounding communities. So really it's this disorganization that really drives these social problems. So that is our, in very, very quick way, outlining our conceptual approach. Look at the methods. We essentially use the CDC definitions of opioid use disorders. We take the ICD X and Y codes. Those would be drug poisonings. And we first assume, just like CDC, we assume that first you have to meet that ICD code, and we look for the presence of one or more opioids in that multiple cause of death, those 20 multiple cause of death. So we have the confidential death certificate data. And so we screen for drug poisonings, and then we take from those drug poisonings, we select those that meet one of these following criteria. One, that they died of a drug poisoning and they had and only had prescription opioids in their system listed as a multiple cause of death, or heroin alone, or synthetics or unknown narcotics. And then lastly, we have multiple cause opioid mortality that would be two or more of the above, either prescriptions in heroin or prescriptions in synthetics and so on. Our definition of opioid use disorder mortality differs from CDC in that we include that those F11 ICD, the ICD code series that are mental and behavioral disorder deaths due to opioids. We include those. However, those are it's a pretty small number. That's a pretty small number of deaths. There's only, I think, 400 nationally that only meet that criteria. So our definition generally follows CDC guidelines, except for that F11 code. We take all the counties in the 48 contiguous United States. We do 3-year pooled mortality rates to reduce fluctuations in really small rural counties. We age adjust the rates, and then we Winsorize the tail ends of that distribution, mainly because when you're doing this latent class analysis in the form of cluster analysis, and cluster analysis techniques are very sensitive to very extreme scores. So we essentially censor the top and bottom range, and I don't think there was any censoring at the bottom range, but we had to censor at the top range because the Z-scores, when we compute those standardized Z-scores, the top Z-score was something like 15. And so we Winsorize at 3.5 would be the Z-score. And that's mainly to improve estimation of the latent profile analysis. So what is latent profile analysis? Again, it's a way to find clusters or unique sub-distributions within an overall distribution. And so the idea of latent class analysis is that if all the elements in a multivariate distribution are the same, there should only be one mixture. If there's differences in that multivariate distribution, then there should be multiple mixtures. And each of these mixtures has a distinct sub-distribution. And so what LPA tries to do is find these unique mixtures within an overall population. You can read through how we go about doing this. With Bayesian statistics, with Bayesian techniques, you have to find starting values. So we do 5,000 maximum likelihood random starts to seed our initial prior probabilities. And we do that with 12 variables. So we have the three-year pooled mortality rates for each of the 4 opioid use disorder mortality measures. That would be prescriptions alone, heroin alone, synthetics alone, and then multiple cause opioids. In the paper, you can read some of the more detailed information, but essentially, statistically, the LPA identified 5 unique classes or 5 unique mixtures. When we looked at the heroin class, we found that even though statistically it was one mixture, the heroin class was split based on its elevation. And so the statistical procedure combined a high heroin group and a moderate heroin group together. And subjectively, we decided to extract that 6th class because we thought it was more interpretable to separate out the very high heroin places from those that just had above average. Probably don't speak a little too long about the methods, but this is, I think, an important point. One of the advantages of using latent profile analysis, because it uses it's a Bayesian technique, is it gives you these posterior probabilities that give you an idea of how certain you are in the classification of that county into one of these mortality classes. And so that's very useful to make sure you drop counties that aren't strongly linked to any one cluster. And so we said that a county can be allocated to these opioid mortality classes if we had a certainty of classification of 70% or more. If it was below 70%, we put it in an unclassified group. So that ensures that essentially our classification has a lot of internal consistency within those classes. Once we've identified those six opioid mortality classes, we then use standard multinomial logistic regression techniques to predict membership in these opioid classes using the low opioid class as the reference group. And we did this again for all the metropolitan counties in the United States and all the non-metropolitan counties in the United States. So the metro model had pretty good fit and moderate classification accuracies among those five opioid mortality groups. The non-metro model didn't fit as well. It had a little bit lower model fit, that pseudo R-square at about 48%. But the main issue is that we had pretty low classifications on some of those opioid mortality classes. So there's need to improve the fit of that non-metro model a little bit more. But in both the metro and the non-metro models, what really was driving model fit is the models did a very good job of classifying counties into the low group or some other opioid mortality class. And so really model fit was driven by correct classification of that low group. The high heroin class was the group that the model did the poorest job at classifying those counties. There was a lot of misclassifications. So we're trying to figure out what variables we can add to our model to better predict these heroin counties more appropriately. In terms of covariates to drive that, to help us predict membership in one of these opioid mortality classes, we used a series of lagged demographic and economic variables. So again, demographics in 2000, you can read with the slide, but that's population density, percent minority population, population age 17 and older, age 65 and older. NAS is the natural amenities scale from USDA, and UIC is the urban influence code, which is a 12-point ordinal variable that measures the degree of urbanization, whether a county is adjacent to or not adjacent to larger population centers. We modeled drug risk factors using non-opioid drug death rates in 2000, base opioid drug death rates in 2000, the prescribing rates for 2006 using the data set from CDC, the dispensing data from CDC, and in 2000, the percent of the population that has a work disability, and that's from the Social Security Administration. Social disorganization factors include median household income, violent and property crime rates, the number of civic and social organizations per 100,000, and and civic participation rates. And this variable is a combination of two indicators that would be the voter turnout rate and the rate of response to census forms as our measure of sort of civic engagement. We can get that data for all counties in the United States. To model economic structure, we looked at employment by place of residence from census by the following industrial sectors. That would be agriculture, forestry, and fishing, mining, manufacturing, construction, transportation and warehousing. RTLES is retail, trade, and leisure services. So leisure services would be tourism, accommodation, food services, personal services, sort of the low-end services. Professional and business is the professional and business services group, and healthcare and social assistance would be obviously healthcare and social assistance services. And then to look at change over time, to look at percent change from 90 to 2000 and 2000 to 2016. And the main reason we do that is there's a body of research saying that really what's driving opioid addiction isn't employment today or even employment 10 years ago, but it's this legacy of employment in injury-prone industries that might have happened, decades ago. And so to model that, we include percent change in employment for those sectors. All right, so we'll stop with the technical details and go to the results. And so what you're looking at now are the age-adjusted mortality rates per 100,000 by those 4 opioid use disorder groups that I identified before. So the first thing you notice on the top left is the prescription opioid mortality. And so one thing you notice right away is that it shot up very steeply in rural areas from 1999 to about 2010 or 2011. And since then, prescription opioid mortality has fallen across the United States. And you see in most of those areas, from the completely rural all the way to the large metropolitan, there's been this leveling off and, if not falling, rates of prescription opioid mortality. And so CDC, on their publications, they call this the first wave of the opioid epidemic, and our results confirm that across the rural-urban continuum. The second wave, according to CDC's terminology, is this heroin wave, and you see the heroin wave began to grow. Really, it's interesting when you look at the two charts. As prescription mortality began to decline starting in 2011, you see a corresponding rise in heroin mortality starting in 2011 and peaking in around 2015. And of course, those spikes in heroin mortality are strongest in more urbanized settings, in the large metros and the small metros and the micropolitan areas. Now, the third wave that CDC identifies is the synthetic, and that would be that bottom left chart. And here you see in large metropolitan areas, deaths or mortality from synthetic opioids is relatively stable, but it really spiked in 2015 and especially in 2016. So you see those spikes in 2016 for almost all types of communities, ranging from large metro to completely rural. And then if we look at the multiple opioid mortality, those two charts look very similar. And so that has led us to conclude that the synthetic opioids and the multiple opioids are really becoming one and the same phenomenon, that most synthetics are mixed with either heroin or prescriptions, because those two trends look fairly similar. So it just gives you basic idea that the prescription phase has sort of passed. We had a short heroin phase, and heroin still is important, but usually not by itself, but heroin's often mixed with synthetics, and that's where you see the spike in synthetic alone mortality and multiple opioid mortality. It would be combinations of synthetics and heroin, synthetics and prescriptions, or a mix of all three. So going back to our classes, so I mentioned that the model identified 5 opioid mortality latent classes, and we extracted a 6th. So if you look at the emerging heroin and high heroin group, the latent profile analysis actually combined those two groups together because they had a similar profile, but the elevations were different. And so we made a decision to separate those two because we wanted to not combine sort of just above average heroin mortality with very high heroin mortality. So what you see are 6 groups that we've labeled as the low opioid mortality class. And again, these are standard deviations, I should mention. So a score of 0 indicates you're at the national average. Negative scores, and they indicate below average mortality rates, and positive scores indicate above average mortality rates. So anything approaching 1.5 or 2 standard deviations above the mean is really high. It's at the very tail end of that distribution. So we see a low opioid class that has low mortality across all those 4 opioid groups. We have the emerging heroin classes, which are high just on heroin and not much else. The prescription opioid class is just high on prescription mortality, particularly low on heroin, and sort of smaller or slightly above average rates for synthetics. We have what we call the synthetic plus prescription opioid mix group that has very high mortality rates on multiple opioids, synthetic opioids, and above average rates of prescriptions. And then this last class, on the far right of that chart, is what we call the opioid syndemic class. And what you notice in the opioid syndemic is very high and growing rates of heroin mortality, synthetic mortality, and multiple opioid mortality, as well as above average rates of prescription mortality. So what is a syndemic? When we looked in the public health literature, we found this term called syndemic, which is defined as these overlapping and co-occurring series of epidemics that reinforce and strengthen this mortality, whatever that mortality could be driven from. Now we take some liberties in the syndemic definitions. Typically, it's referred to in the public health literature as sort of a cause and effect. You have one epidemic causing another epidemic. We really don't make that claim. We just really kind of follow one of the standard definitions from Singer, that it's these co-occurring epidemics with no real direction associated with it. All right. If you were to look at the table, these are, again, the Z-scores. Main interest in this table is looking at the multiple opioid group. And so if you go over to the last two columns on the right, the synthetic plus prescription mixes and the opioid syndemic, you can look below that first line, and even though we identify that these two classes have high multiple opioids, we actually broke those down into the pairings, whether that's from prescription or heroin, prescription or synthetic, and so on. And just the main point of interest in this table is that rural areas, whether they're on the syndemic or the synthetic mixes group, always have a much larger share of prescription drugs. And in the metro communities, these multiple opioids tend to have much more on heroin and synthetics, which I'll talk about here in the next couple of slides. But if you go to the very bottom, you see there are these counties do have a high number of deaths from people that have overdosed on drugs, and they had the presence of both prescription opioids, heroin, and either synthetic or an unknown narcotic in their system, all at the same time. So you see these multiple types of opioids converging on, these individuals were taking substances that had the presence of all three of these prescriptions as they're recorded on the death certificate. Oh, let me see what I have for time. Okay, I'll talk about this really briefly, but you can go back to this because it's kind of interesting. If you read our paper, we discussed it somewhat at length. So one of the questions I get when I go to communities, particularly communities in the upper Midwest, is, the question is, why are synthetics flooding the market? And the standard response is that these drug trafficking organizations, the DTOs, you can call them the cartels, are just, they're bad people, and they don't mind if people die. And that's, of course, one possible explanation. But the main explanation is these drug trafficking organizations traffic drugs because it makes them money. And synthetics, particularly if we take the case of fentanyl, is hugely profitable for these drug trafficking organizations. Because pharmaceutical fentanyl is very tightly regulated and very little of it leaks out of the hospital or the pharmacy, most of what is flooding in the United States are these fentanyl analogs that are chemically different than prescription fentanyl, but often have the same effects on the body in terms of its potency and getting high. And these are very cheap and easy to manufacture. Most synthetic fentanyl, in particular, comes from China, and it's very small quantities. You don't need a lot of fentanyl to blend in with other substances. And so small quantities can be smuggled across the border. It's pretty cheap to make. It's hard to detect. And so the interdiction rate is low. And even if your fentanyl shipments from China are stopped by customs or by the postal service, you're not losing out on much money. But if you go to the table, this is the main issue. So if the Mexican cartel, so the Mexican cartels essentially control most of the illicit drugs that come into the United States. So one of the reasons why Mexico has been so unstable the last 5 to 8 years is there's been conflicts between these cartels as who's going to control the supply of drugs into the United States. And so the Mexican drug trafficking organizations control shipments of cocaine, of heroin, of fentanyl from China. It all comes into Mexico, and then the Mexican cartels find ways to smuggle that into the United States. So heroin, which Mexico does produce in large quantities, that at 60% purity, that generally has a street price of about $80,000. And so they can't really, what they call cut it down or stomp it down. They typically have to, people aren't going to pay a lot for heroin of lower purity. And heroin is a little more expensive to produce because it's a natural product. They have to go up on the mountainsides to get the poppies and cook it down and so on. Fentanyl, by contrast, is manufactured in a factory. So it's a little bit cheaper to produce, but because it's so potent, you can't really sell fentanyl by itself. So 2 or 3 grains of table salt, the equivalent of 2 to 3 grains of table salt or size granules of fentanyl is usually enough for a lethal dose for most people. So you can't sell, fentanyl the size of grains of salt. And so they mix it with other drugs, or they mix it with other non-narcotic elements. And so 1 kilogram of fentanyl can be cut down to 16 to 24 kilograms. And because it's so potent, you can cut that 1 kilogram down to 16 to 24 kilograms, and it still has the same potency as street heroin, and that still sells at $80,000. So that last column, that revenue to the drug trafficking organization, you can smuggle in a kilogram of heroin and get $80,000, or you can smuggle in a kilogram of fentanyl and clear $1.5 to nearly $2 million. So one of the reasons for the spike in synthetic deaths is that it's so profitable for the drug trafficking organizations to do this. They don't want to bother with heroin or cocaine for that matter. All right. So about a half hour right now, so about 15 minutes. I should move through this quickly. I'll let you go through those maps, but the majority of counties in the United States have low opioid mortality. 45% of metro counties have low opioid mortality, 55% in micros, and 64% in rural areas. Those would be the white areas. And if we look at some of the other mortality classes, again, you can go through this later. If we look at heroin, heroin is particularly interesting in that it tends to follow, because it's an illicit opioid, it tends to follow known drug trafficking corridors. So if you look at Arizona and New Mexico, you see those, that would be the orange areas. The dark orange are the high heroin counties, and the light orange or the light brown are the emerging heroin. You see that's Nogales and El Paso, the border crossings, and they follow interstate corridors that tend to be drug trafficking corridors. And so heroin really flows along interstates. It flows to larger cities. You see a corridor running through Missouri up to Chicago. You see a corridor from El Paso up to Denver. And so they really tend to follow known drug trafficking corridors. And because of that, because they tend to locate in large cities, heroin tends to be more of a problem in metropolitan areas than it does in these rural communities. By contrast, prescription places almost sort of avoid large urban centers, tend to avoid major interstates, and so those would obviously be the blue shaded areas. And we see that 11% of rural counties are part of this prescription opioid epidemic cluster that we identified, versus only 6% in metropolitans. And so you see some overlap with reservation and tribal lands. Those would be the hashes, the black and white hashes that you see, particularly in Oklahoma. You definitely see some state policy likely matters. You see, Oklahoma and Tennessee, showing up where you don't see a lot of spillover in other states. And so the prescription epidemic really tends to be in more out of the way, sparsely populated communities away from large population centers. And this is again for opioids or prescription alone. If we look at the opioid, the synthetic plus prescriptions and the syndemic cluster, two things you notice are first that the Ohio River Valley, southern Ohio, northern Kentucky, western West Virginia, that area that was ground zero of the opioid epidemic back in the late 90s and early 2000s, that was mainly prescriptions or prescriptions and heroin, has sort of transitioned to the syndemic cluster. And so it's not just prescriptions that are plaguing these communities, but it's all types of opioids. And we see that coming up. We see the Northeast is heavily, New England, Massachusetts, Connecticut, to a lesser extent New Hampshire, all and Maryland, all have very high, either they're part of that syndemic cluster or that's dominated by synthetic opioids. The other two clusters we see out west is around Santa Fe and around Salt Lake City in Utah. So, definitely you see sort of the what people consider the heart of the opioid crisis. People tend to still think of it as a prescription problem in Appalachia and the Ohio River Valley, and prescriptions are still part of it, but it's now all types of opioids are being abused, mixed together, and so on to usually address supply issues. Okay, so moving on, this is kind of the ending or getting close to the end of the presentation. So instead of presenting you with statistical tables, I think it's probably just easier to talk about some of the key findings from our analysis. So, going back to those charts, as I said before, the opioid crisis in the United States is not just a prescription crisis. And in fact, in many areas, the prescription mortality is declining. So even though opioid mortality rates are rising overall, we see a shifting. We see a transition away from prescriptions more towards these synthetics and these multiple opioid substances. So that indicates a shift. So the implication, of course, is that a lot of prescription drug monitoring programs, their effectiveness is probably going to be limited as users and drug trafficking organizations reduce their dependence upon prescription opioids as they become more tightly regulated, and they'll switch to synthetics or heroin. Second finding, obviously from the latent class analysis, is that there isn't one opioid epidemic, but really three distinct opioid epidemics: prescription, heroin, and synthetics, and one syndemic. So about 25% of U.S. colonies are severely impacted by opioid use disorders. Of that 25%, about 9% are prescription-only epidemic clusters. That's in Tennessee, Oklahoma, Nevada, and Utah. About 7% are in this prescription, synthetic, and mix epidemic. And again, as I mentioned, that's usually a lot of those former prescription places that have transitioned to synthetics. And we think it's probably because of tighter regulation of pharmaceutical opioids that there's been the switch to synthetics. The heroin epidemic accounts for about 5% of counties, and most of these are in large cities. And then lastly, the opioid syndemic is about 4% of U.S. places. So again, that there's multiple epidemics, and each of these might require its own strategy rather than a single national strategy. We did find, consistent with previous research, that all of our opioid epidemic clusters have had a long history of opioid abuse going back to that 1999 to 2001 period. That was strongest in the synthetic and syndemic, where we did not find a major opioid problem in 2000 were communities that had a prescription problem only and a heroin problem only. So in communities that now have a heroin only and prescription only problem, there was hardly any opioid history of opioid abuse. In the syndemic and the synthetic plus prescription mixes, these places always had an opioid problem and was probably due to prescriptions. We do find, again, consistent with research, that overprescribing or overdispensing of opioids at the pharmacy level increases prescription epidemic vulnerability in metro places, but we found no effect in non-metros. So that goes a little counter to what most of the research shows. A lot of the research shows that you have overprescribing does increase rural prescription vulnerability, but we don't find that in our analysis. So we're still trying to figure out what might account for that. One explanation would be in a lot of these rural places, pharmacies are relatively scarce. That would be one explanation. Our most likely explanation, the explanation that we think is most relevant, is we think there's this mismatch between where opioids are prescribed and who's getting that prescription filled. So you might have people are filling prescriptions in one county and then driving back home to use or abuse those opioids in another county. And this is, again, linked to the scarcity of pharmacies, that in these rural communities, they may not have a pharmacy nearby, or you have to cross a mountain range, or you live in a very large county where the nearest pharmacy is quite a drive away. It's more convenient to cross the county line to get that pharmaceutical. What we do find is that what's driving prescription vulnerability in rural places isn't overprescribing, but really work disability. And so again, that's a qualification or a clarification of existing research, and that for rural prescription opioid vulnerability, it seems to be work disability is what strongly correlates to that vulnerability, not overprescribing. And again, what I'll have in the next slide is that we have pretty strong evidence in our analysis that what's driving this work disability is larger and growing shares of employment in injury-prone industries. So what we found, I'll take the rural areas first. So we found both in metro and rural areas, we found that communities that were affected by an opioid epidemic of some sort had larger shares and declining and growing or declining shares in injury-prone industries. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics tracks injury rates, so the number of workers injured per 100 workers. They track that by industry. And they've been doing that since 1994 is the earliest data that's widely available. You can get it by state. We use the national averages here, and we use 1994 because we're looking at change from 1990. But what we find is in rural communities that, so the industry average is about 7.7 injured workers per 100 workers. And we found that in rural communities that are affected by any kind of opioid, they've had falling numbers of jobs in agriculture, construction, and manufacturing. And the injury rate in construction is 14.5, so that's almost double the industry average. In agriculture, that's 10.4, and manufacturing, that's 9.4, all above or slightly above average. Also in rural areas, surprisingly, there's been a small growth in mining in the 2000s, but that injury rate is pretty low. And so when we looked at that data, I only got 5 minutes left. When we looked at that data, what we found is that mining industry has a mix of very low injury rates and then some sub-industries like coal mining, very high injury rates. In metro areas, we found that opioid vulnerability was driven by growing jobs in some of these injury-prone industries like construction and transportation and warehousing. So what we've distilled from this is two possible addiction trajectories are related to work. And so there's counties that have an expanding economy in construction and transportation that likely swell the ranks of these injury-prone these workers that were injured on the job. Most of them probably had some form of employers paid health insurance. And so that addiction vector was probably being prescribed opioids by their healthcare provider through private insurance. Or if they didn't have insurance, they likely sought relief from illicit drugs like heroin. And this might have started that cycle of addiction. So more injury-prone workers because of an expanding economy, and these jobs that were expanding were in injury-prone areas. By contrast, the other trajectory is the more common one that's been talked about a lot, and that's more consistent with what's happening in rural America, is this massive decline in blue-collar jobs in manufacturing and agriculture that left this legacy of unemployed or underemployed people with a work disability. And because they have limited economic prospects, many of them are on Medicaid, and so they were prescribed prescription opioids for their pain, and that this is really what started this addiction cycle. And the literature has kind of talked about this as deaths of despair. All right, so interestingly enough, when we looked at the demographics, we found that prescription-related epidemics tend to occur in communities that have more shares of younger people and more racial and ethnic diversity. So again, this runs counter to what's been discussed, what's been written about previously, where we find that for the prescription epidemic, we find that prescription epidemic counties tend to have larger shares of Native Americans. And you see the states listed all have large reservation and tribal land areas. For the synthetic and prescription cluster, those communities also tend to have more younger people, but they also have larger shares of African Americans. And that tends to be clustered in the Great Lakes states and in some counties in the Ohio River Valley. And so what might explain this discrepancy? Well, when we look at our data, what we find is that these majority white rural places used to be a prescription epidemic back 10, 15 years ago. Now they've all transitioned to an opioid syndemic. So a lot of these syndemic places tend to be mainly white communities, which of course is very similar to the low opioid epidemic. So we think that, for the prescription group, those initial places that were rural white places, they're now in the syndemic class, and what's left for just the prescription epidemic tends to have higher minority populations. And then the heroin epidemic is, dominated by the white working age, is dominated by metro cities that tend to have more white non-Hispanic populations and more working age populations. That again suggests a clarification of the research. All right. So I'm coming at 45 minutes, so I'm not going to cover the last point on social capital, except to say that it does matter, but its effect is relatively modest. All right, to try to sum up the implications, as I said before, it's not a single opioid epidemic, but really multiple epidemics, so that would suggest that we need place-based strategies and responses, not simply a national response. Because of the flood of illicit opioids, there's going to be limits to state regulation. And so even though states are adopting all these prescription drug monitoring program policies, the impact of mediating or lessening or slowing down opioid mortality is probably going to be pretty limited as people switch to heroin and synthetics. What can we do with heroin and synthetics? Well, one would be this has really the opioid crisis has really transitioned from an issue of lack of oversight of prescription drugs, and now it looks much more like a traditional drug problem like cocaine. And so more drug enforcement activities, better border security, better drug intelligence, so they can interdict these illicit opioids coming across the border. And also for those that are currently addicted, really expanding treatment, medication-assisted treatment, making sure that Medicare and private insurance covers that treatment, more addiction services, and of course the introduction of some combination of drug and family courts. Instead of sending people to prison, you try to divert them into other kinds of pro-social restitution that keeps them out of jail and allows them to engage in recovery and to support their families. Our research clearly shows that occupational safety matters, that a lot of what's been driving the opioid epidemic in these communities has been workplace injuries. And of course, then what we found that I didn't discuss is that social capital promotes local agency. In terms of next steps for our project, we are at the stage right now of identifying opioid resilient and opioid vulnerable places. And we're going to do 24 community case studies. We're going to visit 12 resilient places and 12 vulnerable places across the country and try to find out what they're doing what they're doing or not doing that makes their place particularly resilient to the opioid epidemic or makes them particularly vulnerable to that epidemic. And we hope to have a series of best practices. All right, last comment is you can go to the website. The paper, our working paper is on that website. So if you just click on that URL and go to publications and presentations, you'll find it there. So happy to take any questions and appreciate your time and listening to me drone on for 47 minutes.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, David. That was fantastic. We've had a few questions come in, and I know we've got just about 5 minutes, so we'll try and get through as many as we can here as quickly as we can. So the first one came in earlier on when you were talking about the different area fields that you looked at in terms of public health, economics, and criminal justice. And the question was related to the impact of overprescribing of opioids. And you touched on that in your findings, but was that ever considered within the three sort of fields of study?
Yeah, I mean, conceptually, no. So in the model, we did look at prescribing rates from the CDC county level database, even though there's a lot of gaps. We had to do some imputation of those missing prescribing rates. But yeah, we included that in the statistical model. You know, in terms of, you know, trying to conceptually model that, you know, that does somewhat relate to disorganization theory in the sense that if you have poor states, if you have a sort of a weak state or a weak regulation system that doesn't regulate doctors or doesn't regulate pharmacies, you know, and that sort of it's known but not really condoned, or no one really brings it to the attention of the authorities. That's kind of a sign of this disorganization that you know, these pill mills that everyone tends to talk about. I don't know how many actually exist. But this idea of overprescribing, that if people knew it was a problem, you know, there's no way to really measure systematically at the county level whether people knew that and just failed to sanction those individuals. But we do account for it in the statistical model, but we really haven't had a way to get a good county level measure of sort of, is that prescribing rate legitimate or is it illegitimate? We're working on some way to do that. But yeah.
Okay, great.
That answers the question.
Yeah, and then do you think because of the crackdown and on prescription opioids, that has, you know, people have compensated to other types of opioids, and that's contributed to the rise of the syndemic?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think you find that, I think the evidence is very clear. It's hard to establish really causal factors, but at least correlation. If you look at the correlations, yeah, absolutely. I think it correlates very strongly that I don't have it in this paper, but we did look at the prescription drug monitoring program policies by year when they were implemented, and we're comparing what was the prescription mortality rate before a policy went into place and then tracking it after to see what happens to prescription mortality and what happens to overall opioid mortality. So our initial findings show that it's good at reducing prescription alone opioid mortality, but you tend to see an increase in either the syndemic mortality or synthetic mortality, or combinations of synthetics and heroines or prescriptions and heroin. So prescriptions are part of it, but they're being mixed. So yeah, I think that's absolutely right, that kind of the unintended consequence of state regulation of prescription opioids is it's sort of given rise to illicit opioids that puts it in control of drug trafficking organizations, which would require a criminal justice response, not a state administrative response.
Okay, good. Related to the injury-prone sectors, do you know if fishing was included as an industry, or did it?
It's included in agriculture, forestry, and fishing.
Okay. So
we group those together. It's really hard to get employment numbers just for the fishing industry by itself. So one of the problems, I think, with the person that asked the question is probably, if fishing has a high injury rate, it's probably averaged out with the massive agriculture sector. So what we could, I would imagine that if we look at particular communities where we know the fishing industry is very, on the coast, it's mainly fishing, not really agriculture or forestry, those dynamics would change. The problem is that when you get into people that are employed in very small industry, not many people are employed in fishing, the data quality gets problematic. But yeah, I mean, I would suspect that if we were able to isolate phishing employment, we could look at the injury rate for phishing. The problem is that the data quality gets poor when you look at it at the national level. But yeah, I would say the impact of phishing is probably averaged out, and so because it's combined with agriculture.
Great. Well, we are just about at the top of the hour, so I'm going to put the link to our evaluation in the chat box, and I also put in a link to a free brochure PDF from the National Network of Libraries of Medicine that has some free National Library of Medicine resources about substance misuse and opioids. But please do take the evaluation. If you answer yes to the very last question about MLA CE credits, that's how you get instructions for obtaining that information. I know we're right at the top of the hour. There was one additional question. I don't know if you have to run right away, David, or if you have
I don't.
More. Okay, I know others have to run, but this is being recorded, and so when you get the link, you can stick around and watch this very final question.
Let me just say one thing before everyone signs off, is that feel free to read the paper. If you have questions, please send me an email. I'm happy to respond to any emails about questions you have or calls to just discuss it. Feel free to contact me, I guess is what I'm saying.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being open for that. The last question that we had is, you spoke about the general public misperception of the opioid crisis as primarily an urban problem.
Yes.
Do you know if these misperceptions have impacted naloxone availability and training in rural areas? Are there disparities in distribution, or is it generally keeping pace with the rural addiction rates?
Ooh, that is a good question. Well, I would say that at least from the states where we've been looking at particular states that are of interest for our project. And what we found is that a lot of the naloxone distributions tend to go to larger cities, or they tend to go to the corrections department, or probation, it does the probation and parole. And so they tend to always kind of go to larger cities. And I think that the person that posed the question, I think they're partly right that there's probably an undersupply of naloxone in rural jurisdictions, either police jurisdictions or fire and medical jurisdictions or other institutions that probably need it. One, because I think the issue is one based on numbers versus rates. And so a lot of what naloxone is being distributed is based on death counts, not rates of death. And so you might have a small community where the number of deaths is really small, but in terms of a rate, it's a large, it's a large chunk of the population. And so I think that there may be to be made administrative rule changes rather than giving the naloxone to where there's the largest number of deaths, to also have some formula that would take into account the rate as well. Because you might have a large metro area that accounts for a lot of deaths, but the rate might be pretty low, whereas in contrast in a rural community, the counts might be low, but the rate may be high. And of course, the impact on a small population community that may be 5 or 10 deaths, those are a lot of deaths for a county with maybe 1,000 or 2,000 people. So yeah, I do think that there probably is a lack of availability in naloxone, a lack of training on how to use it, maybe even in some rural places, because there's a stigma associated with drug use, maybe a reluctance or a reticence of police and fire services to carry this, that they feel like they may be enabling or encouraging drug usage. I'm not sure about that, but that's one thing we're trying to study.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much again for sticking around a couple extra minutes here. I know we had some technology issues too, but this was very enlightening and helpful. I know I learned quite a bit, and hopefully, we'll be able to follow your continued research and perhaps have you back to present after you've been able to go out into some of these communities with the findings that you get from that work as well.
Right. No, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Derek, and thank you to everyone for giving me your time.
Thanks for watching. This video was produced by the National Network of Libraries of Medicine. Select the circular channel icon to subscribe to our channel. Select a video thumbnail to watch another video from the channel.